Alert from calendar. Gov meeting Class A.
Now I'm going to be standing a little closer to the computer. Does that make a difference? I don't need a close-up.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to our monthly presentations. On behalf of the Atlanta chapter, I want to give you a warm welcome. And before we get started, we're going to make a couple of announcements. Actually, one of them is to all those who are viewing this and those who are attending who are not yet the members of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, National Society of Professional Engineers, encourage you to become one. Join us. There are plenty of opportunities to do volunteer work, develop your leadership skills, and we do a lot of great work. Another announcement that I'm going to make is this month, actually next Monday, is the state math count competition, and math counts is the key event that is sponsored by the Georgia National Society of Professional Engineers. It is going to take place in Elizabeth Springs. If you want additional information, it's an all-day event, but you're going to have a ton of fun watching these kids, middle school age kids, have a blast solving math problems. For additional information, you can reach out to me, reach out to the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers webpage, Betty Jordan. We would be more than happy to speak with you regarding the event. Okay, for this evening's presentation is the OSHA updates and the details on LOTO, and it is not the winning numbers. Sorry to disappoint. Our speaker is Bennet, and she is a graduate of Western Carolina University, and she has 28 years of experience in safety and compliance. So please join me in welcoming Robin to
Thank you. I appreciate y'all having me and inviting me to come speak. My name is Robin Bennet. I was a compliance officer with the Atlanta East Area Office and have now been accepted into a position as the Compliance Assistant Specialist, which affords me the opportunity to come speak to groups such as yourself and provide training and outreach to various persons who request it. So I'm so happy to be here. And let me just say, I'm going to really encourage my area director to start having staff meetings like this, because this backdrop's great. I love the food, the beer, so very nice. So I'm going to encourage him to do the same. Unfortunately, the area director, Josh Turner, had other pressing OSHA business to take care of tonight, so unfortunately he couldn't make it. So I'm happy to be here with you instead. So thanks for having us. Tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about OSHA, what updates we have, get into the lockout tagout regulation, maybe some intricacies in dealing with that regulation, and maybe a couple of updates that we're going to have coming up. We do have a new regulation for heat stress coming out, which if you're very familiar with the OSHA regulations at all, when we have a new one that comes out, it's very exciting. This doesn't happen very often. So I'll get into more information with that as well. So just to let you know, OSHA's continuing mission, we just had a 50th birthday, so we've been around for 50 years, and of course the advancements that's been made with safety engineering devices, which y'all play a major role in, have really excelled over the years, so I'm excited about that. But just looking back at our continuing mission is to, of course, dramatically reduce injury and illnesses in the workplace. And you can see worker fatalities are down on average. There was about 38 on average a day in 1970, but we're still about 14 a day, which is very unfortunate. And of course, we have, hindsight is 2020 with regard to OSHA coming in after an accident, but it's still too many. So we strive each and every day to get those numbers down and keep them down. Worker injury and illnesses are down as well, from 10.9 per 100 workers, which that's the way we calculate our numbers, in 1972 to about 2.7 per 100 workers in 2020. So that's been dramatically reduced. And when you think about it, things like machine guarding and engineering things out take a major part in that. And that is my favorite phrase, by the way, when I go out to a job site, is you just need to engineer that out. So y'all are welcome for the work. OSHA's balanced approach, we do have enforcement. OSHA was set up as an enforcement agency, so we don't give warnings and such. The purpose is to support the regulations and enforce what's there. We do have outreach and compliance assistance, which again, I'm proud to say that I was selected as the compliance assistant specialist. We've been without one in the Atlanta East area office for a number of years, so it's very exciting that OSHA has chosen to move forward with these positions just for this applicability, to be able to provide additional services to those who request it. So I'll get into a little bit of how OSHA is organized. There are federal-run states as well as state-run states. Georgia is a federally run state. And in the federal-run states, we do not have enforcement powers over city, state, and county municipalities. So in federal states, it is the employer, employee, and a private work atmosphere that we have jurisdiction over. And if there's a single employee, OSHA has jurisdiction to come in and perform an inspection at that location. You can see our region. We have 10 different regions. Here are in Region 4, our headquarters are in Atlanta, which affords us, again, a lot of availability to technical support from that office. So we're very lucky to be located where we are. The regional area office functions, we're out there to do a job. We have goals, same as anybody else. We're measured by those goals, and we do that through inspections. But the purpose of those inspections are to help identify and reduce hazards in the workplace. Unfortunately, a lot of times we're there after the fact for accident investigations and such, which we want to be proactive, and we keep striving towards that with strategic planning and such, which I'll get into in just a moment. We do have penalty collection. It's just like a speeding ticket is what I often use in the field. If you didn't have a deterrent effect, you just keep speeding right along to your next place to visit. Same with the OSHA penalty. If there wasn't a deterrent effect when citations are issued, then the fear is employers would proceed in the way that they've been operating. And our purpose is to identify the hazards, eliminate those hazards, and make sure they don't happen again. And it seems like sometimes with the penalties, monetary penalties, that helps emphasize what we're striving to get across to the employers. The employer responsibilities. The way the OSHA Act was set up was it is the employer's responsibility to provide a safe and healthful workplace. It is the due diligence that the employer needs to pay attention to as far as before getting into business, before setting up a piece of equipment for an employee to use. It is up to the employer to figure out what hazards and what training that employee should receive prior to assigning those work activities. So that is the responsibility of the employer. Also to apply with applicable OSHA standards. The OSHA regulations were set up as the bare minimum of what employers absolutely have to do, which I always emphasize during my inspections. So anything an employer can do to go above and beyond the OSHA regulations is a plus, not only for the employer, but for the employees involved in working in that workplace. The post-OSHA poster, there have been a few regulation changes as far as reporting fatalities and accidents, which I'll get into in just a second. And it's really opened a lot of avenues for OSHA in the way that we decide where to apply our enforcement activities. For example, we do have what's called a National Emphasis Program on amputations. So the machinery and equipment and employers that were involved in working that type of machinery and equipment fall under a certain NAICS code. If any of you are familiar with those, NAICS codes, it's an industrial code classification system. So what we found with the reporting of the amputations is we can better target what industries and employers needed our attention in hopes of reducing those hazards and injuries. You can see the numbers, inspections by federal OSHA. Of course, everybody received kind of a dip in numbers during the pandemic, and a lot of our efforts from OSHA were placed on the COVID-19 inspections and protecting especially the healthcare workers. We're coming back from that and going back to the field doing in-person inspections, which we did maintain the entirety of the pandemic, but everybody had to alter their courses over that time. But we are coming back up on our inspection goals and on-site inspections. So within OSHA, we do have special emphasis programs, which I mentioned a moment ago about the amputation NEP, and we as well have site-specific targeting. And the programmed inspections result from special emphasis programs and site-specific targeting. And those are outreach areas which, again, OSHA has identified as being problematic. For example, some of the national emphasis programs involve trenching and excavation, amputations, so on and so forth. So these are just historically areas that have had high amounts of injury and illnesses as well as fatality rates involved in that type of work. So you can see from the top 10 violations, and this goes into construction and general industry, but one of our talking points tonight is overall lockout tagout comes, and the deficiencies associated with that comes in overall between both industries, number 6. So the rest fall into both, mainly construction, but as well hazard communication kind of hits on both areas in general industry and construction as well. Again, I don't know how many people have you, how many persons do you deal with in the construction industry? Not many, mostly general industry. Okay. Well, you can just see an overview of the construction industry and the hazards that we have to look for with that. Number 1 is fall protection. There's always not only a regional emphasis in fall protections to try to reduce those, but it's just a problem area. It continues to be with lack of fall protection both in commercial construction as well as general industry. And here with the general industry, once we get into just general industry, lockout, tagout, you can see still is very high on this list. And again, with the reporting fatalities and hospitalizations, that did change a few years ago, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. But in the past, you only had to report a fatality to OSHA within 8 hours, or if 3 or more persons were hospitalized. So that law has changed, and if one person is fatally injured, you still have to report that within 8 hours. However, now if you have loss of an eye or an amputation, it has to be reported within 24 hours to OSHA, or even one employee that's hospitalized. So if any of those 3 occurrences happen within 24 hours, it has to be reported to OSHA. So, in 2015, Congress passed the Federal Civil Penalties Inflation Adjustment Act. So what that means is each year, with the rate of inflation, penalty amounts go up. For a long time, the penalties stayed stagnant and did not reflect inflation. So that goes on an annual basis now. So every January, you see those penalties edge up just a little bit more. Again, for the deterrent effect. Because so many times what we've seen is either an employer will be cited and simply close up shop and open up under a different name, or just will not pay the penalties and move forward. So hopefully with this rise and OSHA's being more adamant about trying to collect these penalties, it creates a definite deterrent effect for employers. So, yes?
Regardless of the violation? So all violations are the same?
All violations are not the same. So there are different types of violations. There's essentially 4 general types: serious, willful, repeat, and other than serious. And, so you can see here that the serious and other than serious, which is typically record-keeping violations, can be the 14,502 per violation. If you get into a situation of a willful, what's called a willful violation, and that's, OSHA considers a willful violation not that anybody meant anything to happen. However, if during an inspection an employer is found having knowledge of not only an OSHA regulation or a consensus standard and knowing of the hazardous conditions at hand, then and willfully expose the employees to that hazard, then that sets up for a willful violation.
I saw a recent news release about a company being assessed $1.24 million.
Mm-hmm. That's probably got a couple of willfuls in it, yes. Well, they can also go up very quickly with repeat violations, which is not on here, and that just kind of depends on what the circumstance is. But when OSHA does an inspection, we search back 5 years of company history to see if that employer has ever been cited, and it doesn't have to be at that exact location. So if you have Joe Blow Construction working in Georgia and he was cited for the exact same thing in Arkansas, then we may be able to constitute a repeat violation if it's the same circumstances and involves the same type hazards.
Question. How does this fit PSM?
I'm sorry?
How does this fit PSM?
So, for those of you that don't know, PSM is a specific regulation that OSHA has called Process Safety Management, and it is the management of highly hazardous chemicals. And anytime an employer gets over a certain threshold amount of chemicals, then that specific regulation kicks in. And it is, to answer your question, it is the same. However, I can tell you I was one of the PSM inspectors out of the Atlanta East office, and OSHA is, they're very adamant about doing a very thorough inspection with regard to process safety management investigations. And it's because of the background that surrounds the hazards in that type of industry. But as far as the violations as it pertains to PSM would be whatever the findings of the investigation were, whether it was willful, serious, repeat, it would go the same way. And then we do have a failure to abate. So that would be if an employer had an inspection and was cited for a hazard, and they are committed to correct that hazard. And if they do not correct that hazard and have a second OSHA inspection, and an inspection reveals that those same hazards existed that were cited previously, then that would be a failure to abate to the employer, and those penalty amounts can go up. Within OSHA, we do have the ability to make criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. I was also the criminal investigator in the Atlanta East OSHA office. And over my 25-year experience, I had only one criminal referral. And it was for the employer making false statements and urging the employees to also make false statements to me during the investigation. So that was one of the quickest ways to get in trouble, that, altering scenes, things of that nature. So we can make criminal referrals, and OSHA's nationwide has had many criminal referrals over the years. So we like to use a program, Safety Pays. You can see workplace injuries and fatalities cost our economy $171 billion. And the breakdown of that is the wage and productivity losses of about $54 billion. The medical expenses, $36 billion. And the administrative costs are double that. They're around $60 billion. So when you look at the medical expenses costing half of the administrative expenses, that tells me that you don't want to lose that employee. It takes time, effort, finding a new employee, doing training, doing the paperwork, getting the insurance, all to replace that one individual. That had you had that machine guard, had you had that training program, had you enforced those policies, you would have been able to prevent as well all these costs. So definitely safety pays. So with the record keeping, this has changed a little bit. I don't know if anybody's had to come over and electronically report their record keeping online yet, but this was a change. And that was to make everybody more knowledgeable of what injury and illness rates were for any given company. I've really encouraged my construction partners that I use, before you hire a subcontractor, go online, look at their OSHA history, look at their injury and illness rates, and use that when trying to select who you're going to work with and use and let your other employees work with. So this was a good thing. But the record keeping did change, and anybody with more than 10 employees are required to keep what's called an OSHA 300 log, which does report your injury and illnesses. It lists days away, whether it was restricted work activity, and that comes up with what's called DART rate, days away of restricted time. So we base a lot, again, of our strategic planning off what are the injury and illness rates in any specific industry, to then target that industry and try to help lower those injury and illness rates. Certain low-risk industries are exempted, and minor injuries requiring first aid only do not need to be recorded. And the OSHA 300 log, if you've ever looked at those, they do have a nice little directions page that will list out and define what is a first aid case. So it really tries to help you along in deciding whether or not an injury and illness should be recorded or not. Which recording is different from reporting, so just don't get the two mixed up. We do have a record-keeping webpage that's been very successful and helpful in providing information on when do I record something, how do I submit it electronically, which our electronic submissions just recently ended, so hopefully all those 300 logs got recorded properly and timely. So here we are about reporting, which is different than the recording. So, as we were talking about earlier, all employers are required to notify OSHA when an employee is killed on the job, when even one employee suffers a hospitalization, an amputation, or loss of an eye. And inpatient hospitalization must be reported, amputation and loss of an eye must be reported within 24 hours. And really, in my opinion, when OSHA adopted this of reporting all amputations within 24 hours, I don't think OSHA knew quite what we were in for, because there was such a flood of amputations. Prior to this rule, the only time you had to report an amputation was if it involved a mechanical power press, and it had to be reported to the national office within 30 days of the amputation. So you can, and you know, all those kind of went way under recorded, and not a whole lot of information came out of it. So now with this requirement, we are better able to target the industries and the machines and equipment that are causing these amputations. And it's still, in my mind, kind of an astronomical amount. But this is better targeting the agency's compliance assistant enforcement efforts, like I indicated, to specify those industries and areas where we need to place more concern and energies. Now we can submit electronically all the data necessary, and when any establishment has 250 more employees, they are currently required to keep and report electronically OSHA injury and illness logs. And 20 to 249 employees, if your company falls within a certain industry code, you're as well still required to report your OSHA 300 logs electronically. And there's a list of those at our OSHA.gov website.
The list of the industries?
Yes.
Where most of them?
Yes. Yes. So I'll bring up my job again, compliance assistance. So this is OSHA's tool to use for training outreach and to provide better education to the public and employers. You can see the numbers that we've had to visit the OSHA website. OSHA.gov has a lot of information, and if any time you need help in navigating the website, we do keep persons in the office to answer these questions. As your compliance assistance specialist, I'll provide business cards to everyone, and Roger can send out my email and contact information. But anytime you need help in navigating the OSHA website, there's a lot of useful information and tools on there. I'm happy to walk anybody that needs help through it.
That would be anywhere in the country, right?
That would be anywhere in the country, yes. And again, in Region 4, we haven't had a lot of the compliance assistant specialist roles filled. However, even if the office doesn't have a CAS, they still have compliance officers that will be in the office on a daily basis to answer any technical questions. And we always encourage employers and employees to call in. They can do so anonymously. And I can promise you, with the amount of resources OSHA has, when you call in and ask a question, it's not going to be recorded. We want to absolutely provide the best information we can, but we won't be writing names down and making notes that XYZ company called in with a machine guarding question. We need to go look at them. So we just want to provide whatever information we can to help you along. OSHA publications, all these are free of charge. They're paid for with our wonderful tax dollars. So you do find a lot of times that companies will call and try to convince you to buy OSHA posters from them. I just want to basically let everyone know these are free publications. They're always available from OSHA. You can as well obtain most of them, if not all of them, online. And we can certainly direct you into any of the informational pamphlets that you would find useful. We have a variety of compliance assistant tools, and I know these are really hard to read, but COVID-19, brochures, cards, fact sheets, flyers to handouts, handbooks, pamphlets, posters, public service announcements are all available through the OSHA.gov website. OSHA as well offers cooperative programs, so these are more so on the compliance outreach side. We do have various programs that affect both the construction and the general industry side, and efforts of shining a highlight on those individuals and partners that go above and beyond what OSHA requires and have really committed to creating a safe and helpful workplace and an environment where employees can thrive and know that they're safe and ask questions and such. So we have alliances. Here in Georgia, out of Region 4, we have a Georgia Struck By Alliance, which brings in lots of different trade partners from both the private side and the government side, in efforts of training and education and just getting information out about work zone safety, highway construction, demolition, so on and so forth. So that's just one specific alliance. There's also a Georgia-led reduction alliance that we do have battery manufacturers here in Georgia. One very close to us, Roger, up 85, that still continue in this day and age to have problems with overexposure to lead, bringing it home to their families, not proper PPE, not washing and cleaning before they go home. So we continue to see this as a problem. So that alliance helps reduce concerns within that industry. We have voluntary protection programs, which involves the general industry sector, and these are participants that go above and beyond in their safety and health programs, their employee participation, how they conduct themselves at the work site, and they have to go through an audit every 3 years to maintain their status as a VPP member. But that is in regard to that. And then partnerships are typically with construction sites, and that's with any construction site that's going to be in operation more than a year can enter into a partnership with OSHA, again, for advancement of training to probably companies and employees that normally wouldn't have that level of safety and health training or exposure to that type of knowledge. So those are just some of the outreach services that OSHA has. Training and education, we do provide 10 and 30-hour certified trainers that you can use to provide that type education in your workplaces. OSHA does not have trainers themselves. We kind of govern and ensure who the certified trainers are to provide those services, but OSHA doesn't offer that training themselves. They are set up, as I said earlier, as an enforcement agency. We have OTI centers, and that's OSHA Training Institute centers. There are many available throughout the nation. Here in our area, Georgia Tech is the OTI training facility. There is the Susan Harwood grant that offers classes and helps pay for those classes. And our own compliance officers attend these centers for this education. So they're excellent courses, very, very focused on OSHA regulations and how to comply and understand the standards. These are just some outreach events so you can see kind of what OSHA targets over the year. We do have heat illness prevention campaign, which there is a new heat stress regulation in the works. So I think the commenting period has closed on that, so it's still in the process and hasn't come out yet. But each year we do emphasize that, especially as we gear up towards these hot summer months. You can see the other one, the National Work Zone Awareness, Fall Prevention Stand-Downs, Safe and Sound, and Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. These are just a couple I won't spend a lot of time on, but the Fall Prevention Campaign, as you saw on the earlier slides, Falls are the #1 killer in the construction industry, so that's why we continue to place emphasis on the reduction of hazards associated with any type elevated work. And you can see those numbers, 401 fatal falls to a lower level out of 1,100 construction fatalities. So you can see just how many are just spurred from simple falls. So preventable. Safety and health programs. This just gets into, again, safety pays. The 3 key components: management leadership, worker participation, and a systematic approach to finding and fixing hazards. It sounds so easy, and I've said for years, safety is not rocket science, but it's just that system of having a policy in place to be able to help identify these hazards and then eliminate them. And again, as engineers, you can certainly engineer a lot of those hazards out, which always makes a person in my line of work life much easier. And the benefits, again, going back to safety pays, to prevent and improve, reduce, engage, enhance, and increase. It really does. As we reviewed the numbers earlier, you can see safety pays and how the benefits of this can come out. Temporary workers have always been a concern. It seems that they fall into the fine cracks because they'll come from the temp agency and receive very little training. And what I found in my experience is typical is the temporary agency won't necessarily provide a lot of training because they're sending them to a host employer to work. So in their mind, the host employer will train that employee to do the specific site work, whereas the host employer thinks, well, I rented a worker and they should come ready to work and I don't need to do the training. So they fall in that unfortunate area of gray. But 17 million temporary and contract employees are hired by staffing firms over the course of a year. So that's a lot of workers.
Is that 3 million workers in this state? How many across the United States?
That's across the United States.
How does OSHA track the temporary employment situation with very small companies? Do they have notifications with hospitals or?
Other than the reporting requirements with regard to fatalities, amputation, loss of an eye, hospitalization, there is no requirement for an employer to report to OSHA the use of temporary employees.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But both the host employers and staffing agencies have roles in ensuring this. And there have been situations where, again, given the knowledge on either party, where both the temporary employer and the host employer may be cited for hazards that a temp employee is exposed to.
You cited amputations, loss of eye. How about things like back injuries and things like that?
So they do have to record those on the OSHA 300 logs if it's work-related, but they don't have to report those to OSHA. So it does have to be on the OSHA 300 log. And when OSHA compliance officers will go out, that's one of the first things that's requested is the OSHA 300 log. So we can review. Even if we're there for, let's say, a complaint versus a comprehensive inspection, we can still review those OSHA 300 logs. And despite us being there for an individual complaint, let's say, that has, bathrooms are dirty or whatever. If we look at the 300 logs and start to notice a pattern, well, they've had back injuries here and here and here and here, we start doing a specific DART rate calculation just based on ergonomic injuries, let's say. At that time, the compliance officer would call the area office back and report the findings, and the area director would make a decision on expanding the inspection to address those concerns and hazards, or if we would just keep it as a complaint-based inspection in that situation.
So a clarification.
An injury that requires hospitalization, amputation, or a blinding, those have to be reported quickly. Fatalities have to be reported quickly. the other types of injuries get noted on a log, which gets turned in annually.
Correct. Yes. Yes, sir.
I believe that
when you have an OSHA inspector in your facility, they are also empowered to observe and cite environmental regulation fines. Is that correct?
No, sir. In that circumstance, OSHA can only support and enforce the OSHA regulations. So if there was a situation concerning any kind of environmental issue, we would make a referral to the proper agency to address those hazards and concerns.
thank you.
Yes, sir. And again, just identifying the temporary workers, why they're at high risk of injury. They're new. They haven't received a lot of training. A lot of times, in my experience, they've been very young workers a lot of the time. And host employers don't think they have the same commitment to temporary employees as they do their own, or there's a 90-day wait time before they become real employees. So these are concerns and just kind of the culture and mindset that goes around the temporary workers and why it's a little bit harder to overcome. Okay, so our favorite, lockout, tagout. And this I have often described to employers seems like it is one of the hardest regulations for an employer to understand. And there are a lot of intricacies and exemptions to this. But we'll just start walking through it. Have any of you dealt a lot with the regulation itself in the way that you've designed the machine or equipment? Okay, good. So this is to prevent serious injury or death from the unexpected release of any sort of injury from machines or equipment, and to establish procedures to physically isolate the stored energy. And these are not even all of them, but you can see the different energies that need isolation. And a lot of times employers won't think about a hot surface. They'll turn the switch off to, a heated machine and say, well, now it's off, but it may take 2 hours for the heat to dissipate. That's a stored energy, and it has to be addressed in the written lockout procedures required. Lockout tagout regulation applies when servicing and maintaining equipment and unexpected startup of the machine or release of stored energy could occur. When during normal production, workers must remove or bypass a guard or safety device. When during normal production, workers place any part of their body into the danger zone or near the machine's point of operation, and during all setup activities. So the written lockout procedure does have to be written. It has to be in place. There is a couple exemptions for that, for the written part. But the procedures need to be in writing, and the way I've described it to employers is I should be able to come in and shut off a piece of machinery or equipment on day one, as long as I have that recipe of sorts of how to shut it off properly and test the energy sources to ensure that everything is shut off and dissipated. The exemptions during normal production operations. If what they have to do is routine, repetitive, and integral to the production, guards and safety devices are not bypassed, body parts are not placed within hazard's way, and they have to use an alternative measure for protection. This is the only exemptions to having a lockout tagout procedure that is enforceable for a piece of machinery. Yes, sir.
So all of these have to apply, or just some of these have to apply?
All of these have to apply. There is an exemption for cord and plug equipment. If the cord plug is the only energy source, and it is under the control of one person, and it is unplugged. So, for example, if you have a table saw in one room, but my cord runs to the other room and is plugged in over there, I couldn't work on that equipment just simply by going unplugging the cord and plug, leaving it there, and then coming back in here to conduct the work. It would have to physically be under my control. So have that end cord with me while I'm performing that service work. Then you don't have to have a written procedure. You still have to have a procedure. It just doesn't have to be in writing if it meets these guidelines. Because the procedure is for me to go unplug the equipment, keep it with me, keep it under my control. It just doesn't have to be in writing. The written procedure exemption. No potential of stored or residual energy. Single energy source that can be completely within your control. And it de-energizes that equipment. There's no stored energy. Lockout devices under the exclusive control, and no accidents have occurred on the equipment. So I had an inspection once where an amputation occurred, and they met all these exemptions except for this one. And a year earlier, they had had an accident. It wasn't an amputation, but they'd had an accident, a near miss on that machine. So they did not meet all these exemptions, therefore would be required to have a written lockout tagout procedure for that piece of equipment. The lockout tagout elements, the written procedures, they do have to be written except for the exemption. Documentation of each energy source and the magnitudes of energy need to be in that procedure. The standard allows training on those magnitudes of energy, but as the employer, or the person writing those procedures, you're dependent on those employees working on that machine and equipment to remember that training as far as the magnitudes of energy. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've been out on an inspection and asked what voltage you were working on. I don't know. Yeah, so I really encourage employers, document. It provides uniformity of training. It provides enforcement, everything. So with the magnitudes of energy do have to either be known by the authorized employee, the person working on the machines or equipment, or it needs to be in your written procedure. You do have to have locking and tagging devices. They do have to be singularly identified, the locking devices. You can use tags. It is lockout, tagout. However, the tagging system that you're going to use, the employer has to show that the use of tags provides an equivalent level of protection. It is the option of the employer to use that. But in those circumstances, for example, if you have a valve to be shut off, it's not as simple as going and turning that valve off and hanging a tag on it. It would be to remove the valve and then put a tag there. That would afford an equivalent level of protection as would a physical lock. So, in my opinion, locks, of course I like locks better. I'm a safety person. But tagging of the equipment is permitted. You have to have training. We'll get into the different roles of lockout, tagout in a minute. But you do have to have training for what's called authorized individuals, which are the individuals providing the service and maintenance work on at least annual basis. And then you have to have an audit of the work process, the procedures themselves. So here are designations. You do have two within the lockout standard. You have authorized and affected. So the authorized employees are the persons who are actually doing the work to the equipment. Affected persons is everybody else in the facility. So if you have a secretary that's going to be walking out in the facility and shipping, and they may be working on a piece of equipment out there, she's going to be affected or could be affected by that work as she's in and around the work area. She would need to be trained as an affected employee. Your line workers who are not providing that service and maintenance need to know what's involved in the hazards associated with this type of work. So they have to have a certain level of training. The OSHA regulation prescribes affected persons simply have to go through a training. I encourage it on an annual basis. It doesn't have to be on an annual basis. But the authorized individuals, they're a little bit different. They do have to be involved in that procedure review on an annual basis to ensure that they understand everything that is in those procedures, that they know how to apply it properly. And this kind of goes into the procedures. This is a general overview of the procedures themselves. You have to notify, you have to prepare, then you shut down, deactivate the energy, lock out the energy, dissipate it or restrain the stored energy, and then verification that it's off. If any one of these parts is missing from the written procedure upon inspection, it may be cited. So it's very crucial. The procedures are very specific, and whoever's reviewing those can see that they're all there. The isolating devices, it physically stops. So when you're using these lockouts, these locks, make sure they're substantial. And a lot of that, we were talking about PSM earlier, you know, a lot of these pipes and valves and mechanisms have to withstand the weather and the elements. So just keep that in mind if you're a part of the selection process in selecting these lockout locks. One thing it mentions here, it excludes push buttons and selector switches. You can understand if I go up to a wall light switch and cut the light off and take the faceplate off and go to work on it, what's going to happen? The energy's still there. It's off, but it's not locked out. So that's the example I use when we're talking about machines. Just hitting the stop button isn't going to provide a safe work environment when you start working on conveyors or mechanical whatevers when they're doing this. So it definitely excludes the push button and selector switches. The devices themselves have to be...
It also excludes
The interlock switches.
It also excludes the interlock switches, yes. Yes, many like to use light curtains as a lockout device, and no, they are not lockout devices. The devices have to be uniquely, singularly identified and used only for controlling energy. And that's to bring an awareness as to the work that's being conducted. So when another employee sees whatever color lock, whether it's red or whatever you have designated for lockout locks, you should have other employees that are trained. I know what that lock means. I know to not touch it because they're performing work with that machinery and equipment. So that's the purpose of that, is just to bring the hazard recognition. Durable, standardized, substantial. It has to be able to identify the employee. So if I see a lockout, tagout lock in a process area, I should be able to walk up, whether it's a number designation, whether it's the name. I know a lot of employers have gone to hang pictures on it, so you can really identify the person who it belongs to. But it has to be singularly identified in some way. And then tags. If you're going to use tags, must have special warnings and offer that equivalent level protection we were talking about earlier. All employees have to be trained on their worker categories. If they're going to be in that production area, they're either authorized or they're affected, one or the other. And as a trainer for lockout tagout procedures, you must ensure that they understand the training. It's not as simple as just walking through the steps. It also, something to point out, has to be in a language they'll understand. So I've had the opportunity to inspect a lot of chicken plants in my career. And more often than not, those facilities do not have procedures in Spanish or whatever language they're using. So now there are many that I'm glad to see have lockout tagout procedures in about 7 languages, which is great. It took some doing to get there, but they have their procedures in a language that they all understand. And then for retraining, so what a lot of employers don't realize is there has to be what's called a periodic inspection for the lockout tagout that annual periodic inspection is not a retraining of authorized individuals. It is a review of the specific written procedures that are in place to ensure their accuracy and nothing's changed, or any new equipment's been brought to the site that needs a procedure, and so on and so forth. So as that periodic inspection is conducted, all authorized employees are to be involved in that inspection, but it's not a retraining of sorts. Of course, the annual training can always be conducted on an annual basis, but that will not suffice for the periodic inspection as required by the standard. So a lot of confusion around that. Any questions on lockout before we move on?
Is there a special exemption for setting a die, stamping die?
So you can have die setting procedures. It is not going to allow hands in hazards area. It's not going to, it's going to be different from the lockout procedure itself, because it's understood that you have to have a jog phase in there to set the die and get it in place and line it up and so on and so forth. But there should be additional training involved in your die setting procedures. It still won't allow to put the employee's hands in harm's way, but you can have that procedure in place to have it partially energized. Yes. I was just going to mention this one just because it sticks out in my mind. I did an inspection of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution years ago, and they kept having issues with the way the papers were running, and it was heresy to even mention locking out the line before they removed a jam with all these newspapers running through as often as they did. So one of their engineers came up with a system that it was a key system, and the key had to be in place for the conveyor, these machines and equipment to run. But if the individual took the key out and put it in his pocket, it would stop the line, and I'm no engineer, but it controlled the circuits as such that it would, when the removal of the key happened, it stopped the line and disconnected that energy source from that conveyor moving forward. So I felt at the time it was an ingenious resolve to the problem, because they did not want to hear the line was going to be shut down and that somebody had to go get a lock and lock out the equipment. So in a situation like that, persons of your background were fabulous in coming up with a solution for the AJC. So one of our new regulations, as I mentioned earlier, heat stress regulation is in the works. And you can see why. We have over 900 heat-related deaths from 97 to 2019, averaging about 32 fatalities a year. Over 31,000 heat-related injury and illnesses, and $1 billion annually economic loss from heat. And there's been heat-related fatalities. In the summertime, you have those individuals that will go up and lay insulation in buildings and be in Tyvek suits and sit down at lunch and have a Coca-Cola and then go right back to work without having the knowledge of, don't drink a Coca-Cola if you're laying insulation in Tyvek in Georgia in the middle of the summer. So, you know, just that training and education to get it out there, that's why we're promulgating this new heat stress regulation. Some of the emphasis is just workers with water, rest, shade. Allow the workers to acclimate gradually. Plan for emergencies to train workers on prevention, so on and so forth. I've heard some feedback from employers that are really concerned with this. And one of my comebacks currently is high schools have been having to do this for a few years now with their football players and such. You know, they have plans in place when it gets over 80 degrees that this is our plan of action, and we'll sit the kids down and give them water and give them rest and so on and so forth. So, you know, high schools have been doing it. Employers can certainly doing it with their employees who are in the heat every day, not just on fall schedules. OSHA Quick Takes. This is a free newsletter that's delivered twice monthly. You can subscribe through our website. Roger's a fan. You do get the latest news about OSHA initiatives, products that are coming out, worker campaigns like the work zone safety awareness, heat stress awareness, so on and so forth. So if that's applicable to you and your company and workers, it's a great place to get that news. And this is our contact. We do have the 800 line. Within the OSHA website, you can as well identify your regional and area offices, which are manned. The area offices are manned from the hours of 8 o'clock to 4:30, Monday through Friday. And then the 800 number is available 24/7 all year long. So feel free to contact us. Does anyone have any questions?
What was the name of that grant? What was the name of that grant?
It's called the Susan Harwood Grant.
Okay.
And I've got some business cards. If it's, like I said, there's a lot of information on the OSHA website. If you have any questions to walk through, I can certainly get you there. But Georgia Tech does have its own website, obviously, addressing that. Probably the easiest thing to do would be to just Google Georgia Tech OSHA consultation, and it'll feed you into their site, because they do, Georgia Tech offers free consultation services to small employers, what OSHA terms small employers, and that's 250 site employees or less, or 500 corporate-wide or less. So Georgia Tech and that group will come in and perform mock OSHA inspections. They'll do a programmatic review for the company, with the only stipulation being that the company will correct those deficiencies found during that inspection. So they don't report back to us, and we don't ask what was reported, as long as those corrections are made. But through Georgia Tech, they have that consultation side, and then they have the training side. And on the training side, you'll find information about the Susan Harwood Grant. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask, any other questions for Robin? No.
You mentioned something about seasonal employees or short-term employees.
Temporary. Mm-hmm.
Temporary employees.
Mm-hmm.
If they do get injured, will the employers get fined, or is it an exception because they're temporary workers?
So they don't get fined because an employee has been injured. And that's a big misconception through whatever type injury or illness or fatality. The fact that there's been an injury, illness, or fatality is not why a company or employer is cited. They are cited because when compliance officers go in and perform an investigation, they investigate what OSHA regulations were not adhered to. The fact that someone may have been injured is proof that a regulation was not adhered to by the employer, but that's not the reason that the company will get a citation. So if there's any findings that the employer was not adhering to what's required in the OSHA regulations, that's what the citations address. To answer specifically about temporary employees, there is a requirement if a temporary employee, again, is injured as far as hospitalization, amputation, or loss of an eye, to report that to OSHA. And in some circumstances, it's found that the host employer thought the temporary agency would report it, and the temporary agency thought the host employer would report it, and neither reported it. So again, in that circumstance, we would come in, do an inspection. Both companies may be cited for a lack of reporting because it didn't get reported. Because more often than not, in my opinion, somebody's going to call and report it. Even if the company does it, a family member, fire services, emergency services, we get reports all the time from other individuals other than the company that may call in an amputation or a hospitalization. Does that kind of answer your question? Yes.
So you mentioned all of these agencies and organizations that go above and beyond or have different alliances to help other companies comply or themselves comply. So yeah, do you think any of those or any of those specifically would have any information on the company expenditure for different compliance measures, right? Like the average, I guess, amount of money that you would have to expend to address that issue per compliance metric that you need to.
As far as you're getting above my pay grade now. What I can do is get your information and sit down and have a more detailed talk about that. Because through the different alliances, there are a lot of trade partners. So depending on what your company background is, there may be some trade partners involved with the various alliances and or voluntary protection programs that would be able to give you more information about that. And because they are members of the alliance and or are a VPP member, they're committed to provide that outreach as well as part of the alliance and or partnership. So I'll get some more detailed information with you and be able to help you more on that.
Well, Robin, it's been very informative, and on behalf of the group, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Token our appreciation.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation given at one of the Atlanta Metro Chapter meetings of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, an affiliate of the National Society of Professional Engineers. To find out more about us or to join us, check us out at gspe.org.